Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to another episode of Islam for Europeans. I'm your host, Robert. There's a brother who's been following my Twitter, and he deserves a response. He's a good brother. His name is George Mitrusis. Assalamu alaikum, George. And he had a couple of questions regarding my positions here at Islam for Europeans. So I'll address those two questions one by one. So just recently, he asked me, "What is the Medina model?" I talk about the Medina model a lot, many times on this channel. I've also written an article challenging the Medina model, and you can watch the audiobook version of that on my channel as well, or you can go to the magazine Qawwam if you want to listen, if you want to read it. So basically, the Medina model is the model that Muslim communities, particularly in the West, have used for, I guess, Islamic community organization, right? And I call it the Medina model because they look specifically to how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, established Islam in Medina, right? And Medina, was in the middle of the desert. It was basically one culture. It was kind of like a desert culture, and you had a city of at least I think somewhere in the neighborhood of anywhere from 2 to 10,000 people, right? And they look to the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, how he dealt with the people and how Islam spread, and they think this is what we need to do as a Muslim community living in the West. We need to implement what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did in order to be successful. Right now, the problem with that is Medina was a totally different situation than what we have today in the 21st century West. For starters, you have the greatest human being who ever lived, our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him, who basically became the leader of that whole town right off the bat. So he had an enormous influence on the culture of the city. They wanted to be like him. They sought counsel with him, and his followers, were basically paragons of society, right? And in addition to that, the Muslims living in Medina, they interacted with the whole city, right? So it was they were well integrated into the city. Everybody knew one another. Everyone traded with one another. And it was a harsh desert environment. So everyone had to rely on one another in order for the city to survive, right? And that basically the Declaration of Medina, was a testament to that. The fact that the entire city basically signed on to this contract, right? And then another way in which Medina was a different situation is that, like I said, everyone kind of had the same culture basically, and on top of that, the same history with Islam. They were, the pioneers of Islam. Islam had only existed before then in Mecca. So Medina was like a brand new situation. You had the two previously warring tribes, the Aus and the Khazraj. So converting to Islam, it quickly became part of their identity, right? So now, if you compare that to the 21st century West, it just doesn't really jive well, right? For example, you have more than one culture. You have multiple cultures. If you go to any major metropolitan city, you're going to have multiple people, multiple spheres living, and multiple cultures. And people tend to gravitate, towards their own, cultural group. If you go to any city like Toronto or New York, people they tend to like to live in their own ethnic enclaves, right? And the Muslim community is always, Islamic leadership has always kind of been opposed to this. We shouldn't be, calling ourselves Somali Muslims and Pakistani Muslims and Arab Muslims. Let's just call ourselves Muslims. Let's get rid of all cultural identifiers, any affinities or gravitations towards the same group of people based on language, heritage, culture. Let's just get rid of all of that and just be one united Muslim community like we were in Medina, right? And it's a fallacy, really. And the this is never more apparent than when it comes to how they deal with converts, because converts are in a totally different situation. When someone converts to Islam, especially if they're from a European background or Native American or Chinese American. They're the only Muslim in their cultural sphere, right? So you can say, let's be all one united ummah all you want, but the fact of the matter is, you have people converting to Islam. They're the only Muslim in their sphere, and the only way that they can survive, basically, as a Muslim, is to basically join this new Muslim community. Assimilate into this sphere, adapt everything, the culture, the dress, the cuisine, and just basically become one of them, right? And very few converts to Islam in the West can pull this off. And I think that's why a lot of born Muslims in the West say converts are so much better than us. No, I think what's really happening is that you have many people taking their shahada, but only the very strongest are actually, packing up, their things and moving into and assimilating into an existing Muslim community, right? And on top of that, your Muslims are, moving into countries that have a population that has absolutely no history with Islam, or perhaps even a negative history. So, to them, Islam seems very foreign. You know, when you look at Muslim countries, they've already synthesized their culture within Islam. If you go to Somalia, uh, Arabic is spoken prevalently. The cuisine is integrated into the architecture. If you go to Pakistan, everything is like they've incorporated the dress and the cuisine and the architecture of South Asia, and made that part of their Islamic identity. you know but when it comes to Europeans, when it comes to Latin Americans, when it comes to Northeast Asians, when it comes to First Nations, when it comes to certain African countries, they have no history of this. So unless a group of people groups to converts to Islam en masse, right, and implements the same cultural proclivities as a group, where they're incorporating these things, that are that are not forbidden in Islam, but is still part of the aesthetic of their culture. Islam is going to continue to seem like something very foreign to them, and that's just another, I guess, flaw in the Medina model, because you're telling, converts, join us as a Muslim community. We're one united ummah. And, a lot of these converts will, don like a garb from another country. They'll start speaking in an accent. Uh, they'll start, cooking the food of that country. Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but when you have it so that like every single convert is doing this, converting to Islam, from an outside perspective, becomes all the more difficult. On top of changing your whole life around, and practicing Islam, praying 5 times a day, fasting during Ramadan. On top of that, people see these people convert to Islam and completely change who they are, and they're not down with that, right? So, and just in general, the Medina model is flawed because Muslims, just in general, don't interact with the greater society in the West. They tend to live in their own ethnic enclaves. They rarely, if ever, communicate or form friendships, with non-Muslims. Maybe randomly one or two here or there. They don't participate in the same types of things that non-Muslim societies participate in, for good reason. I mean, they do a lot of things that are against our religion: alcohol, like scantily clad women, gender mixing, drug use, gambling. All these things are prevalent in non-Muslim spheres. So you don't see Muslims go to places like rock concerts and hockey games and trivia tournaments, or even participating in sports, that non-Muslims participate in. Right. So the alternative to this approach is what I call the Chapas model. So the Chapas model is basically, I call it the Chapas model because in the 1990s, Spanish Islamic missionaries saw what was going on in Chiapas, Mexico. These Zapatista rebels were trying to take over their territory, and they gave dawah, Islamic preaching to this native tribe called the Tzotzil Muslims in Chiapas, Mexico. And the Tzotzils, they converted to Islam as a group, right? Which means that they had their own cuisine, their own Islamic dress, and they basically ran their own organizations. It was run by them. It was for them, by them, and they understood, the cultural sphere they were living in. They basically, like when you have a group conversion like this, it's a lot easier for not just people to convert to Islam, but actually stay, and change the image of Islam in that sphere to begin with. It's not easy. It wasn't easy for the Zoltan Muslims, but over time, as the years went on, their own society saw that Islam had a lot to benefit their society. So the Chapas model has been night and day, far more effective than the Medina model. And like, and still to this day, many Islamic leaders, they balk at the idea of converts running their own organizations. They say, we don't want to divide the ummah. If it's, and God forbid that European descendant converts do the same thing. We'll say that's racist. Um, but at the same time, every city in the West has multiple organizations that are run for and by Muslims based on nationality, shared language, shared culture. I mean, just in Canada, you have 16 Palestinian Canadian organizations. You know, no Islamic leader ever bats an eyelash at the fact that these organizations exist and say, they should be dismantled, because we should all be one united ummah. All right, so that's the answer to your first question, George. Second question is, and this is a bit more serious and relates to the first, question, is that if in Europe, why do the Medina model? Why have this idea that European descendant converts should form their own groups and collectivize and incorporate the aesthetic of their ancestors? How is that going to be effective if we had the Srebrenica massacre or genocide in Bosnia in the early 1990s? If at the end of the day Europeans hate Islam so much, what's the point if they're just going to end up genociding Europeans or kicking them out of Europe for converting to Islam anyway? It's a valid question. My response to that is severalfold. One is that we're living in 2024. It's not 1993, I believe. I think the perspective on Islam has changed significantly in the last 30 years in Europe. I think that in the 1990s in Europe, there was never really a threat to these countries' cultural identity. I think their main concerns were communism, right, and Islam, basically. So there wasn't really this kind of idea that and religion. So many countries in Europe were very secular. They're very kind of anti-religion. Although some wanted to go back to Christianity, some saw Christianity as like a mechanism to which to fight communism. But like that was like basically the main adversary back in the early 1990s. And Bosnia kind of represented this threat coming from the Ottoman Empire. Even though those threats are unfounded, Bosnia wanted to be an independent nation. They were trying to get their independence from Serbia. They're being attacked by Serbia, and back then, Europeans at large, both the people and the governments, many of them supported Serbia just because they were both Christians, both Christian nations, and Islam was basically the main adversary. Now in 2024, the game has changed significantly. It's not about this threat of Islam or communism anymore. It's the threat of the survival of European cultures in and of itself, right? So a lot of Europeans nowadays, they look to Bosnia in more positive terms because Bosnia has remained relatively culturally intact, and even though they're Muslim, they've they have this kind of like this traditional identity. They have, even though it's an Islamic identity, this kind of, it represents a rejection of liberalism, and liberalism, as they can see, has led to a lot of their downfall. In Europe, the birth rates have absolutely plummeted. The decadence that you see in countries like France have just definitely contributed to that. And with globalization, there's a lot of Gen Z and Gen Alpha. They see globalization as like like the main enemy, basically. Now, the more Muslims I kind of like latch onto that we're like pro globalization, the worse that those outcomes are going to be, right? But I do think that there is a growing minority of Europeans who see the benefit in Islam, and they don't see Islam as the main enemy. They see basically liberalism as the main enemy in and of itself. So there's that. And secondly, just from a strictly Islamic perspective, if you look at Muslim history, every people that is now majority Muslim at one point wanted to wipe the Muslims off the map, right? The pagan Arabs, the Quraysh, they wanted to wipe Islam off the map, right? But Islam entered the hearts of the people so much so that it was this overwhelming, had an overwhelming effect on the people themselves, and Islam eventually won. The Persians, they wanted to eliminate Islam off the map as well. And present day Iran is now majority Muslim. Afghanistan, if you read the spread of Islam in the world, um, there's many accounts of Afghans actually fighting against the Muslims, but Islam eventually won the hearts over of the people, right? So the idea that Europeans hate Islam, yes, a contingent of them hate Islam, but this is the norm throughout Muslim history, and never did we ever stop giving dawah just because a certain contingent of that people disliked Islam. You we have the responsibility of spreading the message of Islam in the West, right? The reaction or the outcome of that, and that's only known by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like you can't say, well, these people hate Islam so much, then what's the point of implementing any type of outside the box strategy if at the end of the day they're going to end up oppressing us? I think that's the wrong way to look at it. We have to look at it like what is most pleasing to Allah, right? And if and lastly, we're looking at governments and government politicians as what the people think about things, and I think it's a very dangerous way to look at problems or like public opinion, towards hot button issues, because we live in the age of social media, and when you live in the social media world, especially on Muslim Twitter, you have people trolling you. You have people who hate Islam, and they're going to troll you. You're going to see all these hate comments, and you're going to think to yourself, "Man, everybody hates Islam." But that's because the people who don't have a problem with Islam or Muslims, they're not going to bother, trolling your account. They're not going to bother and saying, I have no opinion. They're not going to bother you saying, I actually think what you're saying is good, right? So it's not a very accurate scientific way of deciphering what the people think overall about certain things. I mean, I think as Muslims should really do more polling. More research is needed on Muslim attitudes in the West, on attitudes on non-Muslims towards Muslims in the West. I think it's going to be very important because if we don't, we're going to pre-assume that everybody hates us, and that can have very dangerous effects. The fact that still after all the protests for Palestine and all the people converting to Islam, and you still have Muslims who think that they fall into this "they all hate us" fallacy, right? And that's the wrong way to look at things. If you're only looking at what governments are thinking and what politicians are thinking and saying, and what media pundits and like Piers Morgan are saying, it's going to really skew your viewpoint of what the people believe, right? So I think that our outside the box solutions of Islam for Europeans will have very positive effects for the image of Islam in the West. I think that we have a very balanced and humanitarian approach when it comes to things like cultural preservation. When it comes to issues like immigration, and we can decouple these arguments from Islam. And I think the more we try to couple, Islam and status of Islam in the West, with things like globalization, it's going to make things far worse for the Muslim community, right? So those are the answers to my two responses. Thank you very much for the questions, George. But yeah, that's all my time for the day. My name is Robert from Islam for Europeans. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuhu.